Hello and welcome to the Steamy, the Scotsman's politics podcast. There were no major giveaways, no rabbits pulled triumphantly from hats. Nevertheless, this was a Scottish budget firmly focused on the upcoming Holyrood election. Finance Secretary Shona Robinson, an MSP since 1999, may not be standing again, but her draft tax and spending plans on Tuesday afternoon were aimed squarely at May's vote. Indeed, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that many of the announcements were mostly geared towards generating slogans on SNP election leaflets. If we take the changes to income tax, increasing the thresholds for the basic and intermediate rates by 7.4%, more than double the rate of inflation, that allows the SNP to boast that over 55% of Scots are set to pay less income tax because they live in Scotland. In reality, compared to the current tax year, it represents a maximum saving of £31.75 or 61p a week, while middle-class Scots continue to pay substantially more tax than they would if they lived down south. Meanwhile, we had the eye-catching announcement of a mansion tax on properties worth more than £1 million, which will affect a tiny proportion of homes in Scotland because the Scottish housing market is obviously different from the southeast of England. We also had those plans for a private jet tax, which Shona Robinson was unable to say yesterday when she was speaking to journalists how much that might raise. Meanwhile, funding to deliver a breakfast club for every Scottish primary and special school by August 2027. That's something that will no doubt be welcomed by parents, but it's worth pointing out the SNP's 2021 Holyrood election manifesto previously promised this, so it's not new and actually represents a delay. Nevertheless, this was a budget aimed at not rocking the boat ahead of the election. The SNP are obviously substantially ahead in the polls, I think roughly 20 points ahead of Labour, and this was about basically not scaring the horses. It was perhaps a typical John Swinney budget. But to dive into the details, I'm joined by Deputy Political Editor David Ball, by Political Correspondent Rachel Amery, and by the Scotsman's Westminster Correspondent Andrew Quinn. Rachel, what did you make of this?
Yeah, I think the main point is that there wasn't anything massive to come out of this budget because of this election. Nobody wants to get anything too drastic happening at this stage in the election campaign. One thing that I think is quite interesting is quite a few of the sort of the headline figures. So, for example, like this sort of the breakfast clubs, for example, and the Scottish child payment increases. So that's going to increase in line with inflation, but it's going to go to £40 a week for babies under the age of 12 months. A lot of these policies aren't going to come in until the following tax year. So they're more kind of pledges the party is making as opposed to here's what we are doing now. So I think it is very much looking ahead to the election. We're going to see very little changes between now and the election just because of when the financial year ends and when the campaigning begins. But even then, very little in the next year is going to change too. Now, I think as well, something to keep in mind as well, there's actually a lot of spending cuts in all of this. The Scottish Fiscal Commission, the Fraser of Allen Institute, they've got really helpful explanations and analysis on their websites. And they're basically saying, if you cast your mind back to June last year, a lot of cuts were announced by the government, both to day-to-day spending and to sort of long-term investment in long-term projects. And so that is still going to have to come into force in April. So yes, there's all these pledges of things that are going to happen. There is some movement on income tax. There is still a lot of cuts coming in the next financial year in a few months' time. And a lot of it is more further down the line there. But quite I don't want to say bland, but it was a little bit sort of sparse. There wasn't a big, exciting announcement from anything yesterday, which made it slightly difficult for the journalists, I have to say, afterwards, trying to come up with a good story to put on the front page of the papers today. But I think we managed eventually to get something, didn't we?
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, I was at a kind of quote-unquote business breakfast event with Kate Forbes, the Deputy First Minister, this morning, and she herself was basically saying that it was a boring budget, but she was kind of selling that as a positive thing because she was saying that businesses want stability, they don't want unexpected change, unexpected tax hikes, anything like that. And if anything, this is a budget kind of aimed at promoting growth through stability. But Andrew, I'm interested in what you made of this, because for me, so much of the budget was kind of aimed at Labour, in the sense that they were mirroring some of those changes we saw introduced down south as part of the UK Labour government spending plans. For example, they had a mansion tax, albeit it's going to be working slightly differently in Scotland, where it's going to be two extra council tax bands effectively. But they also had, I think the UK Labour government had breakfast club announcements. Again, this is a long-running thing, but the Scottish government's announcement sort of matches that. But the Scottish government has just gone slightly further on issues like tax, which, as I was sort of saying at the beginning, allows them to sort of stick that slogan on SNP election leaflets.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, isn't it? Like, in terms of policy, there's probably not tons between the two parties in lots of areas. It's really Labour would contend that delivery is the issue for the SNP. But yeah, I mean, the mansion tax one was the real one for me that stood out, because obviously in the south of England, in London, that's going to impact quite a lot of people, and it's probably going to generate a decent amount of money for the UK government or local councils. But in Scotland, it's really not. I mean, it's only really going to impact some people in Edinburgh. It will disproportionately affect Edinburgh because house prices tend to be a little bit more expensive there. But there aren't that many folk with homes over £1 million. So it's interesting to see, I guess, how although the SNP are slagging off the UK government in lots of ways, actually they're taking a lot of leafs out of their book. But I think what was really important come to the Scottish election is, as you said, middle income earners getting hit that little bit more. It's something that the Labour MPs down here think that they can use as ammunition, because I guess middle class people vote in bigger numbers than people who are less well off. So they're hoping they can use that as ammunition. They can do, Anna Sarwar's quite often mentioned about nurses paying particularly high levels of tax, while the SNP want to get rid of the energy profits levy. So I think there's things that Labour can use as ammunition. There's not all that much though, really, and they'll use a couple of things like that, but really they'll be focusing on public services as it comes in. I guess an interesting point on that was we saw the NHS spending billions of pounds, but actually it looks like most of that's going to be eaten up by the pay deals. So again, it's another thing which Labour could potentially use. I don't think the MPs have given up all hope of winning the election yet, and it probably hasn't changed all that much after the budget.
Yeah, and I think there was 2 points from what you just said there. I mean, on the mansion tax and just the number of people affected, I think there were only 391 such properties sold in Scotland in 2024-25. So that just shows what a small number of properties actually fall into that £1 million plus bracket in Scotland. And Shona Robinson, the finance secretary, was asked how much money she thinks this will raise yesterday by journalists. She said around 16 million, which, given it will cost 5 million to do those revaluations, is pretty small beer when it comes to the kind of overall budget. And I think she was saying that councils would actually sort of be able to keep this money for themselves, because obviously it's coming through council tax. So Edinburgh, like you say, there might be a higher concentration of these. Well, there will be a higher concentration of these kind of houses. And I think on tax, I think it will be really interesting for Labour, because Anna Sarwar, like you're saying, has had that message that sort of teachers, kind of professionals, senior nurses will fall into this category of people who are paying more tax in Scotland than they would be if they lived down south. His point is always that it's not super wealthy people; it is these kind of traditional kind of middle class professions that are being hit. So I think that'll be quite a big message for Labour going into that election. Although interestingly, Kate Forbes again talking about this morning and saying that to cut taxes for the middle classes in those higher tax bands would have just been too expensive. And the Institute for Fiscal Studies were there at this event as well, and they made the point that to equalise income tax between Scotland and England would cost about £1.3 billion. So they're saying it's a lot of money that if you want to go down this route, and effectively the Scottish government has to balance its budget, so they've chosen not to do that and to spend money elsewhere. So I think if Labour are coming in saying that they're going to make some changes to income tax, I think there is justifiable questions to them as to where they're going to take that money from. But David, you were at a separate briefing this morning from the Scottish Fiscal Commission that I think was talking about council tax, talking about income tax. What was said at that?
Yeah, so that's the kind of the independent forecasters for the Scottish Government, the Scottish Fiscal Commission, and they were basically looking at the income tax stuff for starters, and showing that a lot of people are being dragged into that kind of higher tax band. That's very stark, that there's a big fiscal drag, it's called, happening in Scotland now. And as we've said, that will impact the election campaign for Labour. I think that will be a big talking point. Another one will be council tax, because it's hard to envy whoever's going to be the next Scottish government, because in the coming years they're going to have a lot less money to play with. And a lot of this budget is kind of short-termism by the SNP to kind of get over that line in the election. If you look at the mansion tax and things like that, it's all in the future, and we'll kind of work out the funding when we get there. But on council tax, local government is one of those areas that is set to have quite a huge kind of real terms cut over the next few years. And next year, they're going to have a funding gap. And the only real method that local authorities have to kind of bridge that gap is by putting up council tax. Shona Robertson yesterday said that she expects councils to do that sensibly, but like the Scottish government, these councils have to balance their budget. And if the only way to do that is to hike up council tax, and they've got unlimited, it's not capped this year, then I guess a lot of councils and a lot of Scots can expect the council tax bills to go up, and Labour will use that as the SNP have done this in the election. It's another one that people will feel, and it really angers people when council tax bills go up, especially when you see councils having to do sort of providing less services as it is, and all these extra charges that some of the councils are having to bring in. People really do feel it and get angry by that issue.
Rachel, what do you think about that? Because obviously last year we saw some pretty eye-watering council tax rises. I think roughly across Scotland, on average, they were about 10%. There were some councils that were much higher than that, and it became a real issue. And obviously this time we're going into a Holyrood election. If we have substantial council tax rises, that's going to wipe out any tiny benefit that lower earners will get from the income tax changes. Do you think this could become quite a sort of dangerous political row for the SNP?
Yeah, I think it was a lot of councils last year were seeing double figures. I think mine, for example, was in a double figure rise in council tax. And one of the difficult things is that these are the issues that people really, really notice. A lot of the things that people notice in day-to-day life are actually things that are devolved down to council level. So that's the things like your bin collections, road cleaning, gritting, and all that kind of stuff. And that is the things that people do get very upset about when it doesn't work properly. So that is probably, in some ways, for a lot of people, potentially more problematic than other things that are happening in this budget here. But again, when it comes to just sort of plain household finances, it is just a tax. I'm not sure people will be differentiating of, oh, that's a council tax, that's an income tax, that's being controlled by Westminster, that's controlled by Holyrood, that's controlled by my local authority. I think they will just see it as it's money coming out of my pocket. And when it's election coming up, that's where they'll be looking. So I think it's more that they're going to be looking for solutions to that in the upcoming election, as opposed to looking at who to blame, because it will just be money coming out of their pockets at this point here. So definitely something to keep in mind for the election. And as you were saying earlier, Scottish Labour are very much already showing their hand as to what they're wanting to do when it comes to this in the election. But quite interesting, because we think that the budget is very likely to pass, because previously Anna Sarwar has said that Labour will at the very least not oppose the budget. And that's because they are very confident of winning the election in May. Potentially not, the polls would not suggest that that's likely, but they are confident nonetheless, and that they think that they will be able to control and influence the budget once they come into government in the spring. But that being said, you can clearly see where some of the parties are sort of aligning themselves on the election. We know that that's what Labour are doing. The Conservatives, for example, are going on business rates. They wanted to see more income tax workings there and more support for business rates. They wanted to see a lot of cuts to the welfare spending, which didn't necessarily come through in the budget either. So we're seeing some sort of what parties are going to do in this election coming through in this budget.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting issue, because I mean, Labour, if they're not confident behind the scenes, are at least presenting themselves as confident that they're still in for a chance in this election. I mean, Andrew, have you heard much reaction from Labour figures? Because the chat up here behind the scenes in Labour yesterday, I mean, one of the kind of Labour figure called it a continuity bank manager budget. They were very much saying that, you know, there's nothing in it, it's just boring, the SNP is out of ideas, they're not doing anything. I mean, what has been the reaction down south?
Yeah, it would be pretty similar. They don't think, the Scottish Labour MPs generally don't think that the SNP have much to offer. They've been in for nearly 2 decades now, and yeah, what what have we seen in this budget that's going to radically change Scotland? People in Scotland aren't very happy, and yeah, there aren't any big measures there. So I guess that it gives Labour MPs a little bit of optimism, but most of them privately acknowledge that they're not going to win next year's election. I think among the SNP MPs seem to be relatively positive about it. I think, look, I would say a lot of them are kind of centrist or perhaps left of centre sort of ideas, and they would broadly agree with John Swinney. So they think the moves are generally quite good. They think like the free breakfast clubs and all that are good. I think though, really, who will be licking their lips at this because there's not that many big measures is Reform. They know that there's not big change here. They know that Scotland and the UK both have pretty high tax burdens, and they feel like they can exploit both of them and use them to gain more seats next year. And it's a real unknown, isn't it? Like we don't know who the leader is. We'll find that out on Thursday. Probably Malcolm Offord, we're expecting. But they can have a real go and say, look, actually, there's not that much difference between the SNP and Labour. Labour didn't even vote against the budget. So I think that'll be really where we see the real dividing lines. It'll be more that Reform are presenting a real alternative, and how far they can go is the real question about the election.
What do you think about this, David? Because, I mean, we mentioned at the beginning that for the SNP, this was mostly about not rocking the boat, about not scaring the horses. It was about having a budget that, while the SNP are ahead in the polls, isn't going to shoot themselves in the foot. It's sort of boring is good for them at this stage.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is pretty boring. It is a beige budget. It is probably the most kind of pedestrian budget we've seen from the SNP, definitely in this Parliament. But as you said, that's all they wanted to do. The polling is showing they're on course to win the election. All they need to do is make sure that they keep above Labour. John Swinney wants this majority. At Holyrood's probably not going to happen, but he'll be happy being the biggest party, and he'll be First Minister. The Greens will support them. So I think the budget was just to keep it calm. But there is a lot of problems ahead for whoever forms the government. But for the SNP, it's just there's some good messages that they can put on leaflets in the election out of this. Some of the tax kind of spin is a little bit embarrassing, but it will work in an election campaign. It will, especially for sort of lower income earners who are feeling that cost of living crisis, which the Scottish Government has acknowledged. And there are some good measures. We mentioned the breakfast clubs that are being brought in for lower income earners. And yeah, there is a narrative there that will probably work in an election and will frustrate Labour a little bit. So I do think this is a kind of a positive political budget for the SNP, even if there are kind of upcoming big headaches with the finances. We look at the welfare bill that is kind of just spiraling a bit without much kind of way of controlling that. There's the pay deals. Another thing the Scottish Fiscal Commission was warning is they've given over generous pay deals than it was 9% over 3 years was the pay policy. They've got about 1% left in the final year, which obviously isn't going to be enough to meet some of the public sector pay deals. So they're going to have to find cuts in the rest of their budget. But obviously that's for after the election, and one for either the SNP or, you never know, Labour to have to get their head around.
Rachel, do you think the SNP has done enough with this budget? Do you think that this has ultimately been a success for them ahead of the election?
To be honest, I think that the SNP know this. I'm not sure how much of an impact the budget will have on the outcome of the election. The fact that there was nothing big in this suggests that that's what they want. They know right now in the polls they are ahead, quite significantly ahead of Labour and the other parties that are looking to challenge them. Not quite so. There's a smaller gap between them and Reform just now at the polls, but I think still large enough that they can feel reasonably comfortable at the moment to just plod along with what they are doing. Don't rock the boat, don't have any big scandals, don't upset anybody, don't just promise anything that's too wild and out there. So I think that's probably what we're seeing there. I really don't know how much this budget is going to impact on people's voting when it comes to May. I think that's what the SNP really wanted out of this. So I think that's what we've seen.
I mean, of course, the SNP are partly relying on the unpopularity of Keir Starmer, the UK Labour government. I've spoken to people doing focus groups in Scotland, and they just talk about how toxic Keir Starmer is for Scottish voters at the moment. Andrew, we should touch on the latest U-turn. We've had a series of U-turns from the UK government. They're becoming kind of known for coming up with policies and then backtracking on them. The latest one is about digital ID. Can you just talk us through exactly what's happened?
Yeah, so the UK government was going to bring in a digital ID that was going to be mandatory if you wanted to work in the UK, and they had marketed it as a means of tackling illegal immigration. And actually, the idea had been relatively positive before the UK government announced it, and then as soon as Keir Starmer said he was going to do it, it really dipped in the approval ratings. What's it? Someone said it was like a reverse Midas touch that he had, and yeah, it was really, really unpopular. I think people thought it was controlling. So now the UK government said that it's not going to be mandatory. They're going to bring it in, but it's not going to be mandatory. It's the 13th U-turn apparently since they've come in, and that's less than 2 years. So that's quite a lot. That's more than, I guess we're going more than one every 2 months, which is pretty mad. And also, given we've had recesses, it's probably we're going about every 6 weeks or something like that. We've had a U-turn from the UK government. So although they're getting rid of what would be a toxic policy, and I guess coming up to the Scottish election, Anna Sarwar might be quite happy about that. I think he'll be a bit annoyed that on the day of the Scottish budget, when Scottish Labour can be getting stuck into the SNP and saying to the Scottish public that the SNP isn't doing what people want them to do, I think it's a problem for the UK government to be announcing that they're U-turning on a policy at that time, because it puts the focus back on the UK government, which is exactly what Scottish Labour doesn't want. Scottish Labour wants the focus to be on the Scottish government for this election, to be a referendum on the Scottish government. But UK Labour and the UK government seem intent on reminding the Scottish public of the bad decisions that they have made, and that they can't stick to anything. I think that's a massive thing, though. It's like, how can you really trust the government when you don't know if a policy is going to last 6 months or a year? It causes real problems, and I mean, Anna Sarwar again will be pulling his hair out because it seems like his colleagues down south are basically throwing away all his election chances.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's the sheer number of U-turns. I mean, 13 is absolutely extraordinary, and there's no point in listening to kind of policy announcements if you know the government can just go back in them when it becomes politically convenient for them to do so. And I understand that policies are unpopular, and you obviously want to do something about that, but there is something to be said for just sticking to your guns sometimes. And I think Labour are just, it's become a complete laughing stock in that sense. But Andrew, I saw you nodding along when Rachel was saying that the budget will not really make any difference to the election. So I take it that's something that you completely agree with. That really this is an election about Scottish Labour are going to want to make it all about the SNP's handling of public services, but the SNP are going to want to make it all about Keir Starmer, the UK Labour government, effectively a referendum and what people feel about them.
Yeah, I think that's about right. The only way would be is that it would make an impact as if Scottish Labour can be like, well, actually, they're not doing anything. They don't have any ideas. But I mean, I think there's too much ground for them to make up, isn't it? The UK government really has ruined it for them. I mean, I think we know John Swinney is quite a cautious sort of guy, isn't he? He's perhaps not as out there as his predecessors, in the sense he's maybe a bit more in tune with the kind of small c conservative nature of a lot of voters. And I think he's really shown that there, that look, his party's going to lose about a third of its vote that it got at the last election, but he knows that actually they just need to get it over the line and keep going and not make any blunders, which I think, to be fair to him, he hasn't made that many blunders since coming in, especially given that Hamza Yusuf made so many in the 1 year that he was in. So yeah, it's not going to change things that much. Basically, the defining issue, I think, will be the unpopularity of the UK government, and that'll be what will take the SNP to more than 20 years in power.
Yep. Well, if you want to read more about the budget, and of course you do, because who wouldn't, please stay tuned to the Scotsman's website. There's all sorts of news, comment, analysis on every aspect of the budget, from the politics team, but also from the Scotsman's specialist reporters like Katrina Stewart in education, Alistair Dalton on transport. There's all sorts of detail to dig into there. Please do pick up a copy of the paper as well. But until next week, thank you very much for listening.